Chapter 10 of The Harbor of Doubt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Harbor of Doubt by Frank Williams. Chapter 10. A Mystery. August 29th. Clear. Wind west-southwest, canting to west. Moderate breeze. Knots logged to 12. Noon 1:53. Position 20 miles south, a little east of Cape Sable. End of this day. Code closed the dirty and thumb-worn paper-covered ledger that was the log of the Charming Lass, and had been the log of the old May Schofield for 10 years before she went down. It was the one thing he had saved. He had been on deck, taken his sextant observation, and just completed working out his position. As he closed the old log, his eye was caught by a crudely penned name near the bottom of the paper cover. The signature was Nellie Tanner's, and he remembered how, a dozen years ago, while they were playing together in the cabin of the old May, she had pretended she was captain and owned the whole boat, so that Code would have to obey her orders. As he looked, he caught the almost obliterated marks of a pencil beneath Nellie's name, and, looking closer, discovered Nat Burns in boyish letters. For a moment he scowled blackly at the audacious words, and then, laughing at his foolishness, threw the book from him. Then slowly the scowl returned, and he asked himself seriously why Nat hated him so. That there had always been an instinctive dislike between them as boys, everybody in Freekirk Head knew, and several vicious fights to a finish had emphasized it. But since coming to manhood's estate, Code had left behind him much of the rancor and intolerance of his early youth, and had considered Nat Burns merely as a disagreeable person to be left heartily alone. But Burns had evidently not arrived at this mature point of self-education. In fact, Burns was a good example of a youth brought up without those powers of self-control that are absolutely necessary to anyone who expects to take a reasonable position in society, even as simple as that of Freekirk Head. Code remembered that Nat and his father had always been inseparable companions, and that it was due to this father more than anyone else that the boy had been spoiled and indulged in every way. Michael Burns had risen to a position of considerable power in the humble life of the island. From a successful trawler he had become a successful fish packer and shipper. Then he had felt a desire to spread his affluent wings, gone in for politics, and been appointed the squire, or justice of the peace. In this position he was commissioned by the Marine Insurance Company of St. John's as its agent and inspector on Grande Mignon Island. In his less successful days he had been a boat builder in Gloucester and Bath, and knew much of ship construction. For more than half a year now, Code had been unable to think of Michael Burns or the old May Schofield without a shudder of horror. But now that Nat was suddenly hot on the trail of revenge, he knew he must look at matters squarely and prepare to meet any trap which might be laid for him. It seemed evident that the first aim in Nat's mind was the hounding of the man who had been the cause of his father's death, for that death had occurred at a most opportune time for the Schofields. The heavy insurance on the 50-year-old May was about to run out, and it was almost a certainty that Burns would not recommend its renewal except at a vastly increased premium. As a matter of fact, on a hurried trip that Code had taken, he had picked up Burns himself at St. John's, the inspector coming for the purpose of examining the schooner while under sail in a fairly heavy seaway. All the island knew this, and all the island knew that Code was the only one to return alive. The inference was not hard to deduce, especially as the gale encountered had been one such as the May had lived out a dozen times. Had not all these things been enough to fire the impulsive, passionate Burns with a sullen hatred, the next events would have been. For Code received his insurance without a dispute, and not long afterward, while in Boston for the purpose, had picked up the almost new Charming Lass from a Gloucester skipper who had run into debt. Code now saw to what Nat's uncontrolled brooding had brought him, and he realized that the battle would be one of wits. He got up to go on deck. He had only turned to the companionway when the great voice of Pete Ellinwood rumbled down to him. "Come on deck, skipper, and look over this schooner astern of us. There's something queer about her. I don't like her actions." Code took the steps at a jump, and a moment later stood beside Ellinwood. The Lass was snoring along under full sail. The stranger, which at 8 o'clock had been 5 miles astern, was now, at noon, less than a mile away. Code instinctively shot a quick glance at the compass. The schooner was running dead east. "What's this, Ellinwood?" demanded the skipper sharply. "You're away off your course." "Yes, sir, and on purpose," replied the mate. "I've been watching that packet for a couple of hours back, and it seemed to me she was a little bit too close on our track for comfort. What if she's from St. John's, I says to myself. Then there'll be the devil to pay for the skipper. So, after you'd got your observation and went below, I just put the wheel down a trifle. I hadn't been gone away from her 5 minutes when she followed. It's very plain, Code, that she's trying to catch us." A sudden feeling of alarm took possession of Schofield. That she was a wonderful speed craft she had already proven by overhauling the Lass so easily. The thought immediately came to him that Nat Burns, on discovering his absence, had sent the lawyer with the summons to St. John's, hired a fast schooner, and set out in pursuit. "Maybe it was only an accident," he said. "She may be on the course to Sable Island. Give her another trial. Come about and head for Halifax." "Stand by to come about," bawled Ellinwood. Two young fellows raced up the rigging, others stood by to prevent jibing, and the mate put the wheel hard alee. The schooner's head swung sharply. There was a thunder and rattle of canvas, a patter of reef points, and the great boom swung over. The wind caught the sails, the Charming Lass heeled and bore away on the new course. The men in the stern watched the movements of the stranger anxiously. 10 minutes had hardly elapsed when she also came about and headed directly into the wake of the Lass. Schofield and Ellinwood looked at each other blankly. "Are you going to run for it, skipper?" asked the mate. "I'll have the balloon jib and staysail set in 5 minutes, if you say so." Code thought for a minute. "It's no use," he said. "They'd catch us anyway. Let 'em come up and we'll find out what they want. Take in your topsails. There's no use wasting time on the wrong course." Under reduced sail the Lass slowed, and the pursuing vessel overhauled them rapidly. With a great smother of foam at her bows she ducked into the choppy sea, and came like a racehorse. In half an hour she was almost abreast on the port quarter. A man with a megaphone appeared on her poop deck and leveled the instrument at the little group by the wheel. "Heave to!" he bawled. "We want to talk with ye." "Heave to!" ordered Cole, and the Charming Lass came up into the wind just as the stranger accomplished the same maneuver. They were now less than 50 yards away, and the man again leveled his megaphone. "Is that the Charming Lass out of Freekirk Head?" he shouted. Yes. Captain Code Schofield in command? Yes. Bound to the Banks on a fishing cruise? Yes. All right, that's all I wanted to know, said the man, and set down the megaphone. He gave some rapid orders to the crew, and his vessel swung around so as to catch the wind again. Code and Ellinwood looked at one another blankly. "Hey there!" shouted Schofield at the top of his voice. "Who are you, and what do you want?" The skipper of the other schooner paid no attention whatever, and Schofield repeated his question, this time angrily. He might as well have shouted at the wind. The stranger's head fell off, her canvas caught the breeze, and she forged ahead. A minute later, and she was out of earshot. "Look for her name on the stern," commanded Code. He plunged below into the cabin, and raced up again with his glasses. The mysterious schooner was now nearly a quarter of a mile away, but within easy range of vision. Code fixed his gaze on her stern, where her name should be, and saw with astonishment that it had carefully been painted out. Then he swung his glasses to cover the dories nested amidships, and found that on them, too, new paint had obscured the name. He lowered the glasses helplessly. "Do you recognize her, Pete?" he asked. "I know most of the schooners out of Freekirk Head and St. John's, but I never saw her before." "Me neither," admitted the mate, with conviction. "I wonder what all this means?" Code could not answer. Chapter 10. Recording by Roger Moline.